It was an ordinary afternoon in a quiet suburban town. The sun was shining, and the streets were bustling with people going about their usual activities. People walked to the nearby shops, kids played in the park, and everything seemed peaceful. But that peace was about to be broken. A loud roar of motorcycle engines suddenly filled the air. A group of bikers, wearing dark leather jackets and helmets, rumbled through the streets. Their presence was hard to ignore, and their noise drew the attention of everyone around. Among them was a man who stood out, tall, with a cold and menacing look in his eyes. His name was Tony, and he was known in the town for his unpredictable temper and his reputation as someone who was quick to anger. Tony had been part of this biker gang for years, a member who didn't hesitate to use force when things didn't go his way. It wasn't the first time he had caused trouble, but today would be different. As the gang passed through a small shopping area, Tony's eyes fell on an elderly woman walking slowly across the street. Her name was Miss Gloria, a proud, independent African-American woman who had lived in this town for decades. She was in her 70s, but you wouldn't guess it by looking at her. Ms. Gloria was a strong woman, known for her kindness and her sense of dignity. She never asked for trouble and always carried herself with grace, but she had seen her fair share of hard times in life. As she walked along the sidewalk, she noticed the bikers approaching. She didn't think much of them. After all, the gang often passed through the town. But today, something felt off. Tony, in particular, looked at her with an expression that made her uneasy. Perhaps it was just a feeling, but she couldn't shake it. As she reached the edge of the street, she took a deep breath, trying to focus on her task, just getting home after a quick trip to the store. What happened next was unexpected. Without any warning, Tony suddenly cut in front of her, blocking her path. He didn't give her a chance to step aside or react. With a sneer on his face, he spat a harsh comment at her, his words filled with disrespect. Ms. Gloria, taken aback by his aggression, stood still for a moment, unsure of how to respond. She was not one to back down easily, but she wasn't looking for a fight either. Before she could gather her thoughts, Tony shoved her hard, knocking her off balance. In that instant, her bag flew from her hand, and she stumbled, trying to regain her footing. But Tony wasn't done. He didn't stop there. He pushed her again, this time sending her to the ground. She hit the pavement with a thud, and for a moment, everything went silent. The onlookers were frozen, unsure of what to do. They saw an elderly woman lying helpless on the street, and a biker who seemed more interested in causing pain than walking away. Ms. Gloria was dazed, struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The pain from the fall was sharp, but what hurt even more was the cruelty of it all. She wasn't used to being treated this way, especially not by someone like him. Unbeknownst to Tony, however, there was someone nearby who was about to change everything. As the chaos unfolded, no one expected what would happen next. The bystanders who had witnessed the scene were frozen in shock. People stood at a distance, unsure of how to react. Some wanted to step forward and help, but they were hesitant, afraid of the bikers' anger. Tony had a reputation for being tough, and no one wanted to risk drawing his attention. The scene was tense, and the silence that followed was thick with uncertainty. Among the crowd, a man had been watching the events unfold. He had just stepped out of a nearby cafe, taking a break from his duties as a Navy SEAL. His name was Marcus, and he was Ms. Gloria's son. He had been visiting home after a long deployment overseas, spending some time with his mother and catching up on family matters. But nothing in his military training could have prepared him for this moment. When Marcus saw his mother lying on the ground, the world seemed to slow down. His heart raced, and a rush of emotions flooded him. He didn't know exactly what had happened, but he could tell that something terrible had taken place. The biker had pushed his mother, someone Marcus had always seen as a symbol of strength and resilience, and now she was hurt. Marcus took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. His military training had taught him how to stay calm in stressful situations, how to think quickly and act with precision. As he looked over at Tony, he could see the biker standing tall and menacing, unaware of the storm that was coming his way. The biker had his back turned to the crowd, laughing with his friends, clearly thinking that he had gotten away with something. Marcus didn't waste any time. He pushed through the crowd, his eyes never leaving the biker. His instincts kicked in, and everything he had learned as a Navy SEAL came rushing to the forefront of his mind. He knew that the situation had to be handled with care. There was no reason to escalate things further than necessary, but he also knew that he couldn't just stand by while his mother was disrespected like that. He moved quickly, his steps steady and deliberate. As he got closer, Tony finally noticed him. For a brief moment, the biker's eyes narrowed in confusion, but he didn't recognize Marcus right away. To Tony, Marcus was just another person in the crowd. He didn't know that he was about to face someone who had been trained to handle much more dangerous situations than a petty confrontation. Marcus reached Tony's side, and with a calm but firm voice, he spoke. "Hey, you need to stop." His words weren't a threat, but a clear command. There was a quiet authority in his tone, one that immediately caught Tony's attention. The biker paused, sizing him up for a moment, still not sure who this man was or what he was capable of. But Marcus wasn't going to let this go. He kept his voice steady, looking directly at the biker. His focus was unwavering. The anger he felt for what Tony had done to his mother was bubbling just beneath the surface, but Marcus knew that losing control would only make things worse. He needed to stay calm. He needed to de-escalate the situation, and that meant keeping his emotions in check. The crowd, which had been silent until now, began to murmur. Some recognized the seriousness in Marcus's presence, while others wondered if this would turn into a fight. But Marcus remained calm, and with each passing second, it was clear that Tony was starting to feel the weight of his actions. He was no longer the big, intimidating biker he had been a moment ago. The presence of Marcus, composed and powerful, was enough to make him pause. As Marcus stood facing Tony, the tension in the air was palpable. The biker, still trying to figure out who this man was, finally looked Marcus over, his mind starting to process the situation. Tony had seen many people in his life, but something about Marcus made him pause. The way Marcus stood, tall and composed, gave off a quiet strength that seemed to demand respect. It wasn't like anything Tony had encountered before. This wasn't the reaction he was used to getting. Normally, he could intimidate anyone with his loud presence and aggressive attitude, but Marcus didn't seem fazed at all. Tony's confusion grew, and for a brief moment, he took a step back, unsure of what to do next. The crowd around them began to quiet down, sensing that something important was happening. They weren't sure how things would unfold, but they could tell that Marcus wasn't just anyone. His calmness was a stark contrast to Tony's unpredictable behavior. Marcus, on the other hand, was fully aware of the gravity of the situation. He could see the biker's hesitation, and while he was tempted to act immediately, he knew that losing his cool wouldn't help anyone, especially his mother. The last thing he wanted was for things to escalate further and put others at risk. He had been trained for high-pressure situations, but this was different. This was personal. With a steady voice, Marcus spoke again, but this time, his words were clearer, more commanding. "You need to leave her alone. She's not the one you should be angry with." His words were firm, but not threatening. He didn't want to create a scene, but he couldn't just let Tony get away with what he had done. Tony took another look at Marcus, his brow furrowing in confusion. "And who are you, huh?" He spat. "You think you can just come here and tell me what to do?" Marcus didn't flinch. He knew that Tony was trying to assert dominance, but he also knew that sometimes standing firm and not backing down was all it took to defuse a situation. His voice remained calm as he answered, "I'm someone who won't stand by while you hurt my mother." Tony's eyes widened just a bit. For the first time, he looked at Marcus as more than just another person in the crowd. The words "my mother" hit him differently, sparking a flicker of recognition in his mind. But it wasn't enough to stop him from feeling a little defensive. He had always been the tough guy, the one who didn't back down from anyone. The last thing he expected was for someone to challenge him like this. The crowd had grown silent, everyone watching, waiting to see how this confrontation would unfold. A few people had stepped closer, quietly whispering to each other, unsure if they should get involved. Most, however, stayed at a safe distance, hoping things would calm down without any further incident. Marcus took a breath, trying to keep his thoughts clear. He wasn't looking for a fight. His military training had taught him that the best way to handle a situation like this was with control and clarity. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that Tony probably didn't even fully understand the consequences of his actions. He was just a man full of misplaced anger, looking for a way to feel powerful. Still, Marcus knew that the last thing his mother needed was to see a confrontation spiral out of control. He wasn't about to let Tony make her feel small, and he wasn't going to let his own emotions take over either. He needed to stay focused, to stay calm. Tony finally broke the silence. "What, are you some kind of hero or something?" His voice was rough, filled with a mix of frustration and uncertainty. He wasn't sure whether to laugh or get angry, but Marcus didn't flinch. He simply stood his ground, unbothered by Tony's outburst. The silence stretched on as Marcus and Tony stood facing each other. The crowd around them was still, watching every move. Tony was beginning to realize that Marcus wasn't going to back down. For the first time, he could feel the control slipping from his hands. Normally, he was the one people feared, the one who could intimidate anyone with just his presence. But this man, standing before him, was different. Tony shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly uncomfortable. His hand twitched, as if he was looking for something to do, but there was nothing to grab onto. He was trying to maintain his tough persona, but inside, he was starting to question if this was a battle he could win. The last thing he expected today was to meet someone who could stand up to him without fear, someone who wasn't intimidated by his threats. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Tony finally spat, trying to regain some control. But there was no conviction in his voice anymore. He was trying to find the right words, but Marcus had already taken the power in this moment. Marcus remained calm, his eyes locked on Tony's, his posture relaxed yet firm. "I'm the son of the woman you just hurt," he said quietly, but the strength in his words was undeniable. "And I'm not going to let you do this to her, or anyone else." The words hit Tony harder than he expected. For a brief moment, he hesitated, his anger giving way to confusion. He glanced over at Ms. Gloria, still on the ground, struggling to get up. He hadn't thought much about her before. She had been just another person in his path. But now, seeing her in this state, he began to feel the weight of what he had done. It was one thing to act tough and push people around, but seeing a frail elderly woman like that, it made him feel a little ashamed. But Tony wasn't the type to back down easily. He had spent his life being tough, trying to prove himself. The idea that he had made a mistake or hurt someone unnecessarily didn't sit well with him. So instead of backing off, he turned his anger towards Marcus. He tried to push past the guilt, trying to regain the tough image he had built for himself. "You think you're some big deal just because you wear a uniform?" Tony scoffed, trying to sound convincing. "You think you can stop me?" Marcus didn't flinch. He was used to being challenged, used to difficult situations, but this wasn't about proving anything to Tony. It wasn't about showing strength or power. It was about protecting his mother, about standing up for what was right. His military training had taught him to think strategically, to stay focused on the bigger picture. And right now, the bigger picture was making sure his mother was okay and that Tony understood the consequences of his actions. "I'm not here to fight you," Marcus replied. "But I will stop you if you try to hurt anyone else, and I'll make sure you understand why you can't treat people like that." Tony's bravado faltered for a moment. He wasn't used to being talked to this way. He had always been the one in control, the one people feared. But Marcus wasn't scared, and it was starting to eat at him. The biker stood there, trying to maintain his tough image, but inside, he was beginning to feel a little unsure of himself. Marcus could see that the biker wasn't completely sure of himself anymore. That was a good sign. Tony wasn't as confident as he had been a few moments ago, and that made all the difference. Marcus wasn't looking for a fight. He wasn't looking for any more confrontation. He just wanted to make sure that this situation didn't escalate further. As Tony stood there, still processing Marcus's calm but firm words, the quiet around them deepened. The crowd watched, waiting to see what would happen next. Would Tony back down, or would he continue to challenge the calm strength that Marcus had shown? The tension in the air was thick, and it seemed like time had slowed down. Marcus stood tall, unwavering in his position, while Tony continued to struggle with his own emotions. The biker was trying to maintain his tough exterior, but the doubts were creeping in. For the first time in a long while, Tony found himself questioning his actions. The crowd remained silent, watching every move. Some had already pulled out their phones, capturing the scene, while others simply stood by, hoping for the situation to resolve peacefully. No one wanted things to escalate, but no one knew how to handle a biker like Tony either. People in the town knew him as someone who didn't back down from anyone, but Marcus wasn't just anyone. After a long pause, Tony shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his eyes still locked on Marcus. There was something different about this man, something that made Tony realize he wasn't dealing with the usual confrontation. Marcus wasn't trying to fight him, but he wasn't backing down either. It was unsettling, and Tony couldn't quite figure out how to handle it. "Look, man, I don't want any trouble," Tony muttered, though his voice lacked the usual confidence it had moments ago. It was clear that Marcus's calm and steady demeanor had started to chip away at the biker's bravado. Tony had expected someone to cower or argue back, but Marcus was different. He wasn't reacting the way Tony wanted. Marcus didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced over at his mother, who was now sitting up on the sidewalk. Ms. Gloria had managed to gather her strength, but the shock of the situation was still evident on her face. She was still holding her side, trying to steady herself. She hadn't expected to be pushed down in broad daylight like that, and the pain from the fall was taking a toll on her. Seeing his mother, Marcus felt a deep urge to make sure she was okay. He had grown up watching her handle life with dignity, even when things weren't easy. She had always been a rock in his life, and now it was his turn to be her protector. He approached her slowly, careful not to alarm her. "Are you all right, Mom?" he asked gently. Ms. Gloria looked up at him, her face softening. "I'm fine, baby, just a little shaken up, but I'll be all right," she reassured him, though her voice trembled slightly. Marcus smiled softly at her, giving her a nod, but his attention quickly returned to Tony. Tony, still processing the situation, glanced back at the crowd and then back at Marcus. He could see that Marcus wasn't leaving anytime soon, and he knew that he couldn't keep up this act of tough guy intimidation forever. The crowd wasn't on his side, and there was no real reason to continue pushing the situation. He could feel the anger inside him begin to fade, replaced by a creeping sense of shame. "You're lucky it's not worse," Tony muttered under his breath, his tone softer now, but the pride in his voice still lingered. He didn't want to admit that he had overstepped, but he also didn't want to escalate things further. Marcus took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving Tony. "You need to think about what you've done," he said calmly, his voice steady. "It's not about being tough. It's about being better than this." For the first time, Tony's face softened a little. He didn't know what to say. He had been the bully for so long, always looking to prove himself to others. But now, faced with the calm strength of Marcus, it seemed so unnecessary. The crowd had quieted down even more, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Tony wasn't as tough as he had wanted to be, and it was clear that Marcus had won this round, without ever raising a fist. Marcus turned back to his mother, his mind already focusing on getting her home and making sure she was safe. The situation had calmed down, and though Tony hadn't exactly apologized, it was clear that he had learned something in that moment. Marcus didn't need to make Tony admit it. His actions had spoken louder than words ever could. The moment hung in the air, like a brief pause before the final notes of a song. Marcus stood beside his mother, making sure she was steady on her feet. He could see the lingering discomfort in her eyes, the shock still not fully gone, but she was strong. He could always count on her strength. As he helped her up from the ground, he felt a wave of gratitude and concern wash over him. His job now wasn't just to protect her, but to make sure she never had to face something like this again. Ms. Gloria looked at her son, her face softening as she stood tall, brushing off the dirt from her clothes. She was shaken, yes, but she wasn't going to let that show. After everything she'd been through in life, she had learned how to keep going no matter the circumstances. But seeing her son step in like that, standing his ground in the face of aggression, filled her with pride. "I'm all right, baby," she said with a reassuring smile, though the tension in her voice told a different story. "Don't you worry about me. I'm just fine." Marcus gave her a small smile in return, but knew better than to let his guard down completely. His focus was still on Tony, who had taken a few steps back, seemingly unsure of what to do next. The biker stood there, scratching the back of his head and glancing around, clearly uncomfortable now. The confidence he once had was gone, replaced by a sense of unease. The situation wasn't going the way he'd hoped. "I'm sorry," Tony mumbled, his words hesitant and lacking the force he normally carried with them. "I didn't mean for things to go like this." The crowd, which had been silent and anxious up until now, seemed to exhale collectively. The tension that had filled the air seemed to lessen, and a few people even dared to step closer, exchanging looks of surprise. No one had expected Tony to apologize, least of all Marcus, but something in the biker's tone told them that he was realizing, maybe for the first time, the impact of his actions. Marcus, however, remained quiet. He didn't need to hear an apology, though the words were surprising. What mattered was that the situation was resolved without further escalation. Tony's attempt at an apology, while unexpected, was enough to show that he wasn't entirely beyond redemption. He was still a man who could change, maybe not in an instant, but the seeds of reflection had been planted. "You should think about how you treat people," Marcus said calmly, his voice measured. "It's never too late to make a better choice, but hurting people won't make you stronger. It just makes you weaker." Tony, still unsure of himself, didn't respond right away. He stood there, almost like a man lost in thought. The crowd, who had been waiting for something more dramatic to unfold, seemed to lose interest in the confrontation now that the intensity had faded. Many of them began to disperse, murmuring amongst themselves, perhaps even feeling a sense of relief. For Marcus, the situation was already over. He turned to his mother again, giving her a gentle nod. "Let's get you home, Mom," he said softly. "You've had enough excitement for one day." Ms. Gloria smiled, a little more genuinely now, and linked her arm through his as they started to walk away from the scene. She had been through so much in her life, and now she was grateful that her son was there for her, showing her that she didn't have to face things alone. As they walked off, Tony stood there in the same spot, his gaze following them for a moment. He didn't know what his next step would be, but one thing was clear. Something had shifted inside him today. He might not be a hero, but he'd learned a lesson that would stay with him for a long time. As Marcus and his mother walked away from the scene, the weight of the moment began to settle in. It wasn't just the physical relief of knowing that his mother was okay. It was the sense of quiet triumph, the feeling that they had managed to make it through something difficult without letting it break them. Marcus kept his arm around his mother, supporting her as they walked down the street. She was still a bit shaken, but she was doing better now, walking with more confidence. The noise from the crowd slowly faded away as they left the area behind, and the day seemed to return to its usual rhythm. The calm after the storm was always strange, as if everything was returning to normal, but a little bit changed at the same time. "Thank you for being there, Marcus," Ms. Gloria said softly, breaking the silence. Her voice was still gentle but filled with gratitude. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Marcus smiled down at her, his heart warmed by her words. "I'll always be here for you, Mom," he said, his voice steady. "You don't have to worry about that." They continued walking, the path ahead of them peaceful. Marcus's mind drifted for a moment to what had just happened. It was strange to think that something so sudden could have caused such a stir. But deep down, he knew that it wasn't about the confrontation. It was about the lesson that had been shared in that brief moment. As they neared their house, Marcus began to think about Tony. The biker had left, but there was still something lingering in Marcus's mind. He hadn't been looking for a confrontation, but he had felt a responsibility to protect his mother. And in doing so, something had changed in Tony, even if it wasn't obvious right away. Marcus didn't think the biker was a lost cause. He had seen something in Tony that made him believe that he might be able to change. It wasn't about being a hero or making a grand gesture. It was about showing people a different way. At home, Ms. Gloria took a seat in the living room, letting out a deep sigh of relief as she sank into the couch. "I don't know how you do it, Marcus," she said with a tired smile. "You always know what to say, what to do." Marcus sat next to her, looking at his mother with admiration. He had learned so much from her growing up. The way she carried herself, the strength she had even when things were tough. She had always been his example, and now he realized that, in her own way, she had been teaching him how to be calm in difficult moments too. "It's because of you, Mom," Marcus said softly. "You've always been the one who taught me how to stay strong, how to keep going no matter what." Ms. Gloria smiled warmly, her eyes softening with pride. "Well, you've done a good job, son," she replied. "I'm proud of you." The conversation fell into a comfortable silence as Marcus sat back, reflecting on everything that had happened. He hadn't been looking for a fight or a dramatic resolution, but sometimes that's how things unfold. In the end, it wasn't about winning or losing. It was about doing the right thing, standing firm when it counted, and showing kindness and understanding to those who needed it most. Marcus didn't know what the future held for Tony, but he hoped that, in some small way, his actions had made a difference. People weren't defined by one moment, and everyone had the potential to change. It wasn't about changing overnight, but about taking one step at a time in the right direction. As the evening light started to fade, Marcus felt at peace, knowing that no matter what came next, he had done what he could to make the world a little bit better. And that, he thought, was enough. The next few days passed quietly, but the memory of what had happened still lingered in Marcus's mind. He couldn't stop thinking about Tony, wondering if the biker had truly learned something from that day. As much as Marcus wanted to believe in the possibility of change, he knew that it wasn't always easy. People had their own ways of thinking, their own habits, and sometimes it took a long time for them to break free from old patterns. But despite the uncertainty, Marcus felt a quiet sense of hope. He had done what he could. He had stood up for his mother, and he had tried to show Tony a different way. The rest was up to him. A few days later, as Marcus was finishing up his work at home, he heard a knock at the door. When he opened it, he was surprised to see Tony standing there, looking a little out of place. "Hey man," Tony said, his voice more subdued than Marcus had ever heard it. "Can we talk for a minute?" Marcus raised an eyebrow, unsure of what to expect. The last time they had spoken, Tony had seemed angry, defensive, almost like he couldn't care less. But now, there was something different about him. He looked almost humble. "Sure," Marcus said, stepping aside to let Tony in. "What's on your mind?" Tony hesitated for a moment before speaking. I wanted to say thank you," he said quietly, his eyes meeting Marcus's. "I've been thinking about what you said that day. About not being tough just for the sake of it. I never really thought about it like that before." Marcus listened, surprised by the sincerity in Tony's voice. He had expected some kind of excuse or deflection, but instead, Tony was being open. It wasn't an easy thing for someone like him to admit. "I've been a jerk for a long time," Tony continued, his voice lower now. "I've hurt people, done things I'm not proud of. But I don't want to keep living like that. I don't want to be that guy anymore." Marcus felt a shift inside him. It wasn't the apology he had expected, but it was something even more meaningful. Tony wasn't just apologizing. He was recognizing his own faults and taking responsibility for them. It was a small step, but it was a step in the right direction. "I appreciate you saying that," Marcus replied, his voice calm but filled with understanding. "It's not easy to look at yourself and admit when you're wrong, but it's the first step toward making things right." Tony nodded, looking down at his feet for a moment before meeting Marcus's gaze again. "I know I've got a long way to go, but I'm trying. I just wanted you to know that." Marcus smiled, a sense of warmth spreading through him. "That's all anyone can do. Keep trying. It's not about being perfect, it's about getting better." They stood there for a moment in silence, a quiet understanding between them. Marcus didn't expect Tony to change overnight, but the fact that he was trying made all the difference. It was a reminder that people were capable of growth, no matter where they started. "Thanks for giving me a chance," Tony said, finally turning to leave. Marcus watched him go, the weight of the conversation still lingering in the air. He didn't know what would happen next, but he felt good about what had transpired. He had helped show someone a better way, and that was enough. As he closed the door and leaned against it for a moment, Marcus thought about the journey ahead. Life was full of unexpected moments, and not every battle had to be fought with force. Sometimes, the greatest impact came from standing strong, showing kindness, and giving others the chance to change. With that thought in mind, Marcus smiled and went back to his day. He knew that, no matter what happened, he had done his part, and that was all anyone could do.